meeting. I call this December 12th Sammamish Planning Commission meeting to order here in the City Council chambers of Sammamish City Hall. Tonight we have an exciting topic to go over, some small cell and 5G stuff, so everybody's looking forward to that. So let's get through our formalities here. First, let's do roll call, starting on my left.
Mark Lewis.
Rituja Indapure.
Mark Boffman.
Eric Brooks.
Larry Crandall.
Josh Amato.
Thank you. Is there any comments or concerns about the agenda for this evening? Nope. Seeing none, we'll call the agenda approved by common consent. Approval of the minutes from November 7th. Anyone have any comments on the minutes from the prior meeting? Seeing no comments, we'll say that the minutes from the November 7th Planning Commission meeting are approved by common consent. Next is public comment for non-agenda items. So anybody that wants to talk about anything other than our topic for this evening, and I'm looking at Mr. Stickney in case he has anything.
I would just say happy holidays.
All right. Okay. No non-agenda item public comment this evening. Good. So now we'll move right into the meat of things. And start with some discussion about wireless small cell technology. Dennis, I will look at you to start.
All right, we'll bring up tonight's presentation. The first part of the presentation is just going to be a recap because it's been a bit since we've been together to discuss this. So for you, the members of the audience and those watching, next slide, please. So what we're going to cover tonight is we're looking for some direction here at the end of the meeting. Going to do a recap like I just mentioned. Cover a bit about the code change and the intent of the code. Talk with you about a meeting that we had with the providers between this meeting and the last meeting we had with you folks. And then ask for some discussion and then a bit of direction. And we tentatively have a public hearing scheduled for January 16th, 2020. And thank you. So real quick, how we got here. We started off with a farmer's market and getting some input there. We had a booth out here for 2 back-to-back farmers market midsummer. And then we had a link on Connect Sammamish. We had 4 inquiries on that, and I forwarded those to you folks. And then we had a meeting with the HOA members. We did a mail out and had, I think about 6 or 7 folks show up. And 1 or 2 questions basically came out of that. We really focused on not so much with the HOA members, not about the code, but more or less about the process, and they may get a knock on the door sometime in the future. Committee, we had a tech committee meeting. I need to apologize, I'm battling a cough here. We had a meeting with a tech committee, and then with the providers, of course. We have used some consultants and legal as well. Should share with you in the tech committee meetings, we had some discussion about whether or not to include the schools. We did not, but I did reach out to the schools and heard back from one of them actually today. Had some questions about why we're reviewing the code, but other than that, didn't seem to have too much concern. But again, that was just today, so if there's any other additional information, of course, before we meet again, I'll share that with you. Planning Commission, of course, we had the meeting on September 5th, and then one in a work session October 17th, where we first presented the first draft. We are here at the December 12th meeting, of course, for another work session with a revised draft. And again, as mentioned, January 16th, we tentatively have a public hearing scheduled. And then once we're done with the public hearing and council or the Planning Commission is ready to make a recommendation to council, it would then go on to council early 2020. And you've seen this slide, but again, just a quick recap. The reason we're changing the telecommunication code or the wireless code, 4 reasons. Just to clear some of the conflicts, and it's also dated, ensure compliance with state statutes, gain compliance with FCC rules, and then really, of course, the deployment of 5G itself is coming down the pike. So as we are looking at a new code, what's going to get repealed, the complete title that currently exists for wireless facilities, the definitions in 21A15 that tie into 21A55, the Wireless Facilities Code, permitted uses under 21A20, of course, that tie into the wireless facilities, and then there's a little bit of a loose reference in design to town center. Just wanted to point that out. Okay. So Really, before we get into the revisions, really wanted to take a moment here and cover the flow of the code as opposed to just diving into the woods, if you want, looking at each individual tree, just the overview of how the code is constructed and why, okay? So we know we have the FCC shot clock to deal with, okay, and some time constraints. We know we have limited fees that we can collect to recoup costs for the resources for review and staff time. If we go to the next little block there below that, we know that small wireless cell facilities probably are going to be batch applications, right? I mean, the FCC rules even talk about that. The batch applications, meaning they typically are going to work when they're deployed in a group, 30, 40, 50, whatever size of batched applications. And given those scenarios, those two situations, we can then go on to the next little block where we know that we have limitation on time, but yet we still have, and we have less fees to collect. So we have staff having to review potentially a batched application, 30, 40 batched applications. We have a limitation on when we can get those out, and we have a limitation on the fees that we can collect to cover those costs. So how do we navigate that and still have some sort of control or say within the community, even though we're dealing with some federal preemptive legislation? So we came up with the concept of exempting those small wireless cell facilities. The carrots are, of course, like no notice, no appeal. And so that's the concept behind the code. And then if they're outside the exemption, if it's not exempt, then they'd have to go through the full code, the full land use review process, land use permit process. Okay, the next slide. And again, so the process is we have the exemptions, and then the permit type, that's okay, we can, and then the permit type, type 1, type 2, like we call out within the code. So if you're not exempt, you go up to the permit type 1, type 2. If they don't meet that criteria, they fall into the variance. A key thing, another key thing that we structured the code for is to ensure I'll use the word rigidity. It's not quite the word I'm looking for, but right now that's what's coming to mind. A rigidity in the sense that the public knows, the elected body knows, staff knows that there's a forum in place for processing these applications to where the community or an elected official can say, well, how is that out there? Why did staff put that out there? The process we have created in this draft code is that you meet the criteria, you meet the design criteria, you meet the siting criteria, we can go through that and show that in the code, and it's tied to technical issues, whether or not it can go in the location that they're wanting or not going to that location. As you recall in the code, we talk about having a consultant on staff to ensure review of the technical analysis that is required from the providers when they make application. If they can't meet the exemption because of that, then they go into the permit type. If that doesn't work for them, they go into a variance. Every step along the way, we've created a situation that we've tried to make it as black and white as possible and not as least arbitrary as possible for the siting of these facilities. So that's the construct we're trying to work in here. Next slide. So the exemptions are, again, small wireless, new or existing. The EFRs, the eligible facility requests, is still the most common one we see today. And that would be like doing an equipment replacement on like a macro cell tower. The TV antenna, small satellite dish are just sort of a carryover from our prior code. We're just carrying along. It may not necessarily fit per se, but it's a carry along because it's addressed in that code. We just didn't want to leave it behind because if there's a question, at least we have it defined what it is in case that pops up. And then temporary facilities and emergency facilities we all have is also exempt. So I want to dive a little bit deeper into the exemption again and get into that construct before I get into the edit conversation here. So again, the exemption, we're looking at the largest number of applications being batched, like I said. We can't stop or prohibit the deployment. We have the shot clock and the fees collected. And so we've exempted these for these reasons, carrots and whips to direct the providers through the application process, okay? So we really want them to go through the exemption process, and we've intentionally created the code to make it more difficult to get outside that exemption process. And that is to protect the city in terms of timing and making sure we meet those shot clocks as close as we can and dealing with potentially a large batched application. And so those carrots and whips, again, so we have the exemption for noticing as a carrot, okay? We had some conversation. There was concern about what if somebody comes in and just all of a sudden there's a pole in the neighborhood. We've put in their construction notice then, right? As we've talked about that required, and they must contact the property owner within 1,000 feet of the desired location. And so I've had some pushback about the providers through, as you look at the tiering system, about 1,000 foot checking with property owners in a 1,000 foot radius of where they may want to go. That seems a bit onerous. But if we're going to exempt them from the noticing, and we balance the concern of how is the public going to know that there could be a wireless facility coming in the community, if you contact people within 1,000 feet of where that site's going to be, they're going to know. The provider contacted them. So we did the notice, and that's a process that has to occur before they make application. So it's in the hopper before they even make application, and so the public is aware that it may be coming, and we haven't fired the shot clock yet, okay? We have no land use permit, and it's not appealable. That's a carrot, okay? That's the exemption. But it must meet the design and location criteria within the code, okay? That's sort of that whip. If it's not exempt and you get outside that, then you have the full noticing, an appeal, maybe even the variance process that goes to a public hearing. So trying to keep all of that context in place is what's dictating, at least my review and my recommendation to the Planning Commission about what changes should we be making to the code and what changes we shouldn't be making. We start tweaking those areas, that construct that we have to really direct the providers into the exemption process, it starts to weaken that, okay? And then, then if it's a weaker process, I don't have to worry about the exemption. I can go over here, I can go over here, and then all of a sudden we start to lose a bit of control maybe of what the community may want to have these end up looking like and how they go into different locations. So we did have a discussion with the providers. From the last meeting to this meeting, we were not necessarily on the same page, and that I think was fairly clear. So we had a meeting with the providers. It's scheduled about 3.5 hours. I think we met for about 3 or so. And a lot of the edits that they had were technical, and we agreed on almost all those technical edits. An example was we were using small wireless facility and microcell throughout the code. We cleaned up at small wireless facility. We cleaned up WCF to where wireless cell facilities used consistently throughout the code. So we did sort of those changes and other edits that were like that, technical in nature, okay? The key issues we didn't necessarily agree on was the variance. I think there has been some comments wanting us to soften that up, but we really don't want to do that. We want to stay with the way we have that language. We want to keep it tight because it is a standalone variance from the other variance process, but it's also one of our whips, if you will. And so if we start to soften that up, then why would I have to worry about the exemption process? I can go get the variance. It's a pretty easy process. Noticing, same way. We've taken the noticing out for the exemption process, but we've made it fairly stringent for the non-exempt. And that includes, and I'm using the term noticing for even contacting the other property owners within that 1,000-foot radius about locating within that site. Okay, they're finding out that it's coming in, right, by going through that process. And then the design issues have been a point of contention. We've heard the providers say, well, that's not exactly how it looks. It can look like this. We want to see some, how far is the canister offset? And Verizon did provide us some examples, but when we went through it internally, we really felt that those were more like design standards and not aesthetic standards. And so those types of design standards, and talking with Public Works, and Public Works is here this evening, that they are probably better fit within the Public Works design standards. What we're trying to focus on is the aesthetic aspect. How are they going to look? Okay, and in that regard, we're saying that for those standards that we've gotten from the providers, that's fine. They go in the Public Works design standards. But if there's a conflict between those standards and, say, the design criteria, we did put in this draft that's before you this evening that if there's a conflict, it'll go with the design standards because that gets to the public health and safety issue. Okay, so we talked about that. And the tier system, one of the things that we had left our November meeting on is that we might hear something back on that. I had heard primarily T-Mobile had an issue with that from one of the other providers. But nonetheless, I did get comment later on this week, and I think you've gotten it, that I still think there's some concern about the tier system. But that tier system, again, is a way for us to navigate where and how those poles go in without us saying no. Remember, we can't say no. right? And so then how do we control where they're going, and how do we try to direct them into an area that we may want and have it go into an area that's probably going to be more of an issue than say, another area? So that's that tier system. And then in that tier system is also the variance process. So again, you can see if you weaken the variance, you weaken the tier. If you weaken the tier, it's sort of all into that together to keep that construct of the code in place. Next one, please. So key changes that you saw, most changes are technical, as I mentioned. We didn't get an alternative to the tier system. We did get some critique back, though, again. We did add the definition of franchise in a franchise section in the code that's in front of you because we talked about putting them on city polls. And then there was a lot of discussion about, well, how is that going to work? And what are the issues that surround those? And so what we came up with is, maybe that's a dialogue that fits better with the franchise process that goes before council. So that's what we put in there. So we didn't say absolutely no to going on city polls, but you do need a franchise agreement to connect or to put those facilities in the right of way. Well, if you need a franchise agreement, it has to be approved by council, it's going to go in the right of way, then that can be negotiated at that time you're doing the franchise agreement, whether or not they can connect into a city pole. So that's what we've put in there. We did table A corrections for some review times. There were some errors in there. Table B, which is the under tier 1, if I remember right, we didn't have private streets, and that's now listed, and that should have been. We do have some new language that we also added in that says the variance may go beyond the shot clock. So in the narrative that the FCC created in describing when you can bust a shot clock, and if I believe that's the term the FCC uses in this narrative, busting the shot clock, is you can do that if there's some extenuating circumstances. So a city could bust a shot clock on a permit application, let's say it's a 60-day one, if we can show that there's a set of situations or circumstances that warrants that. In other words, you have one planner, and that planner's doing 7 permits, and here comes a batch application of 30 small wireless cell facilities, and the other applications that were in the hopper have to be processed before the batched application. There's no way you're going to meet the shot clock. There's a provision in that rule that says it can be busted under those extenuating circumstances. Well, if it can be busted under those extenuating circumstances, the city didn't create that situation, right? It was just the process of how things happen and the permits coming in. Same concept then applies to a variance from our perspective. We're giving you an exemption process. Oh, you want to go outside that? Then there's tier 1 process. You want to go outside that? There's the tier 2 process. You want to go outside that? That's the variance. Okay, so because of their siting issues, they went beyond the exemption and beyond tier 1, beyond tier 2, and opted for the variance. We didn't create that. So from our perspective, we're going to use that language, what the FCC says, and that's extenuating circumstances that allows a shot clock to get busted. So if it gets busted, it gets busted. We've had legal review that, and the language that's in there is what legal has helped us create. And that's the other reason I'm a little bit leery about changing some of that language in the variance, is because legal did help us draft that narrative, okay? And then other key changes. The providers did say below ground equipment is a problem. Public Works, and chatting with them, concurs. It's a problem here with our water table. So that was basically saying no longer the preferred method above ground equipment or on the pole. So that's a pretty significant change. Again, I talked to you about the section of the code is aesthetic based, and that's really what we're trying to hang our hat on here, is the aesthetics of the deployment, and not so much the structural, how it gets put, or the offsets, but how does it look, okay? Small wireless facility height corrected to match the FCC rule. We had to do that. And then we revised the section of 090 and added a 095, which is the section for noticing. And if I can have the next slide. And the reason we did that was because we had some dialogue with the Planning Commission on that, and there was some concern about that. So we added under A, that there would be construction notice for work in the right-of-way shall be required. And that's currently how it's put in the code. And what's also currently in the code is that it says it'll be with what we currently have in terms of construction notice. Well, I looked at that and I pulled it, and that's like a 4-foot chunk of plywood out in the right-of-way for like maybe one pole. So even though that's what's currently in the code, so today what I'm suggesting is what I underline there is that the notice shall be in the form of a door hanger, the narrative to be provided by the city. So that would be a revision that we would be proposing even from the draft right here, okay? And then because of that, we talked about, well, what is adjacent in terms of letting the property owners know? And so from our conversation, we added that. We added adjacent as inclusive of a pole in the right-of-way, the 2 closest parcels on the same side of the street as the pole location, as well as the 2 lots closest to the pole location across the street or the right-of-way. Okay, so it covered that. We expanded that a little bit. And then the next slide, we have a quick recap of our decision types, type 1, type 2. And again, this gets to the carrot and the whip concept. A type 1, which is primarily small wireless facilities, okay, is a decision by the director, no administrative appeal. Type 2 is appealable to the hearing examiner. Those are going to be mainly like the macros, okay? And then the notice, we did a connection to Title 20 for the process and the required information that's needed. So that's all spelled out in Title 20 currently. And so we just linked that into that process of what's needed at the application time and how that application process is done. It's spelled out in Title 20, so we created that link in this draft. So these are the key PC comment revisions from our last meeting. We did the height that we talked about. The next one down was the city-owned poles. We did that through the franchise. This is a bit redundant, but this captures the key comments we took from you folks. The noticing, we tied that to the facility type in its own section. We modified the variance to include dimensions, not just location. A cabinet set from 4 inches to 6 inches. There's a bit of a conflict. I noticed in one other area we changed it to per owner. My suggestion is we just we do them all to per owner, whether it's a PSE pole, an HOA pole, or even a city pole. That offset, we can just say per owner, I think. Type 1 and 2 permits follows process in Title 20, because there were questions about what is our process going to be. And then avoid conflict with the noise ordinances, we made that change. Next one, please. And then here is the comment summary and a recommendation. So I haven't had a chance to totally digest all the comments that we got. But the reason I'm comfortable sharing with you what a recommendation is because of the time I took this evening to talk with you about the integrity of the code. We've structured for that integrity of the code to try and create as much control in a situation that we really, by federal law, have very little control. And my concern is if we start tweaking around with that structure, we start to lose a bit of that. If you weaken the variance, if we weaken any of those components, those legs I've mentioned, I think there's a problem there. And so that's why I have those off on the left. The proposed substantive revisions, as I'm calling them, exemption permit. I haven't really seen much come through the door. Like I said, I haven't had a chance to do a comprehensive review of the comments that came in the last day or two. But I did see noticing edits, tiering edits, variance edits, and design edits. From staff's perspective, at this point in time, other than cleaning up the design criteria and getting rid of redundancies and tightening that up a little bit, any of those on the left-hand side, we're recommending no changes except for grammatic changes and tightening up that code and getting rid of redundancies. And the reason I've put in bigger letters down there, any substantive revisions has the possibility of weakening that form of that draft code that I've spelled out for you this evening. The proposed minor revisions, those are great. Technical terms or grammatic changes, distinguish franchise from a lease, because in there we say maybe if it's on private property, a franchise, but it really is a lease. That's a good catch by the providers. Design edits for redundancy and placing in the appropriate sections, as I mentioned. One of the comments that came in we had 2 comments from the HOA meeting. One, we need to update our list. The other one is wireless or street light. In other words, we were saying it could be a wireless, and the question was, well, instead of a wireless, could we have a street light? But we want to be sure not to have a street light put in if it's a dark sky protected, neighborhood, but that's a covenant under their subdivision. I think we probably could, instead of it just being a monopole or a wireless pole, because there's no poles out there saying the subdivision because of the dark sky. Well, they may want the monopole or the wireless pole, but another subdivision may want, instead of those wireless poles, additional street lights. So maybe we call that out in the code. And then another issue that has popped up in conversation is, well, what if there's no sidewalk on one side of the street and there's landscaping up all the way to the pavement? And so what we would recommend is prefer that the installation is on the street side with sidewalk that has that amenity zone, or right of way with no landscaping, okay? And so If you have like one side where there is the street sidewalk, one side where there's not, and there's landscaping all the way up to the pavement, and the property owner doesn't know that, well, then why disturb the landscaping if you can go across the street into an amenity zone that has a sidewalk? If both sides don't have it, then we could possibly look at allowing a wire strand connection. We currently prohibit that, but we could say just a wire strand connection only in those situations where there's a wire and you have those hanging. They're not as aesthetically pleasing. And that's why we don't allow them. But in that situation, maybe better than tearing up landscaping. And so that's another alternative. But at the end of the day, if there's no wire to connect it to, and if there's no curb gutter and sidewalk on the side, and they have to come in, they may have to come in. But that's the best scenario I could try to come up with for consideration. So we'd probably do a revision around that in one form or another is what we're recommending. Next slide, please. So again, the terms, this is sort of a redundant slide. I meant to take this out, actually, and that last slide was going to be mine. This is just a recap of everything I just told you on the last slide, okay? So that was staff's recommendation, and next slide. So after today, if we have a meeting of the minds and the Planning Commission is comfortable and we get some direction from you folks, then we'll be doing some of those edits as prescribed on that prior slide and come back to a public hearing January 16th to take comment and to present that draft to you at that time. Any questions? I'm sure there's lots.
Thanks, Dennis. I want to just start by saying thanks for all your work on this and the staff that worked on it as well. I think that it's worth noting the unusual nature of this particular topic, given the fact that we have some time pressure from, in this case, it's the FCC, but an outside entity that's putting some time pressure on us to do something. It's an unusually complex and evolving technical topic. You know, it's a little different than trying to argue about sidewalks. We have stuff that we don't even know what it's going to look like or how it's going to work. And frankly, if you do any kind of research at all, you'd say that nobody else does either. So trying to create some code for the unknown is a challenging thing, and I really appreciate that. And of course, it's evolving quickly, so I have a feeling we'll all get the chance to revisit this a few times along the way.
That's correct.
So what we'll do, I think, is just go through and do questions and discussion for a bit. And keep that between staff and the planning commissioners, and then we can do public comment after that. All right, so I will say, does anyone have questions? And I have quite a number that I'd like to ask, so I just want to warn you and ask for some tolerance and patience, but I will obviously let others go first. Rituja?
Yes, I will go first. So thank you, Dennis, for the detailed presentation and also the spreadsheets which sort of track the changes. I think that was very helpful with all the questions and your comments on why you accepted some comments and why some of them you didn't. So I have a few questions. I think one of them is under the franchise agreement. I just wanted to understand what's the difference between networks versus communication providers. I know there was a specific request. So yeah, if you could help us explain.
That one I'm not 100% sure of, to be completely blunt and honest. I think the concern there was some language in the code, if I'm touching on the right point that you're talking about, that talks about sort of like network. It's escaping me. Network ability or network capability or something like that, as opposed to. Is that sort of what you're asking about?
I'm just trying to understand what the difference is, with so many providers getting sort of consolidated.
From my perspective, the provider would be like AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile. Network could be T-Mobile's network of cell communications, 5G to a 4G tower to a 3G, however, fiber optic. So that would be the network, and the provider being the company that does the service for that network.
Okay, because the ask was that we put the word networks in there, and so I just wasn't sure if that was required or not. Andrew has a comment?
Maybe I missed it.
I'm Andrew Zager, City Engineer. I might be able to chime in. There are network providers, and there are actually companies themselves. For instance, Zayo Communications, all they do is provide fiber optic. Verizon has a fiber optic section, but they also have the cellular network. So you have two different type of entities, and you can have agreements with each. So that's probably in long lines of what I'm thinking that's referring to.
Okay, and so I just wanted to ask, if not including networks means we're excluding them out specifically, or do they not cover, these regulations don't cover them, or this code?
Yeah, I don't think so. Now that I understand, I don't think that it's excluding the other one, because my understanding is the folks can even contract for the work as well with maybe a provider. Yeah. So it's not excluding, right,
No.
it's not excluding them. Yeah.
All right. And under the same definition, I think that it says, franchise agreement for an additional 10-year term, and I think probably AT&T was asking for 10 years.
Correct.
What was their rationale behind asking for 10? Is it 5
I
years?
would ask them when they're up, but I think it's probably just a classic negotiation issue where funds are involved with inflation. If I have a lease for 20 years at $200 a month, I'm ecstatic. But if I have a lease for $200 a month and it goes years to year, it's going to go up every year because of inflation. So from the city's perspective, a shorter term franchise means it gets to be revisited to deal with like a CPI increase, where a longer term, you're sort of locked in. And so I think anytime you're negotiating, the one side's going to want a shorter, one side's going to want a longer. And I'm looking to Public Works because he's going to be probably the key one doing the negotiation.
So typically our franchise agreements are either a 5-year, 10-year, and then they have a clause in there for reoccurring, so we can extend it for like an additional 5-year period 4 times. So it allows us to revisit it every so often or cancel and renegotiate. Typically, we like to have 5 years and then like say 4 or 5, extensions that can be made to that agreement. So technically it's a 20, 25-year term if we let it play out.
Okay. And then maybe, Andrew, you can still be there, because I think there were some, so under 21A 56.130 under design requirements, there was again a comment for 1A, and we were waiting for feedback from Public Works. I just wanted to know if you guys had a chance to chime in there. And I think it's the same thing for 3A as well.
Dennis, I'm going to look to you to
So
recall what
can
that
you
was.
citation one more time, please?
So 21A.56.130, 1A.
1301A. And that is the design section, just so everybody knows. And 1A illustrations. And so you were after, so that's the illustration narrative that we talk about. And so
I think your comments in the grid said we're
Yes.
waiting for Public Works input, and I was just wondering what else are we waiting
that came out of our
for?
conversation with what I shared this evening about the more technical drawings are going to go in the design standards, the aesthetics will go into our design criteria, Public Works standards will, if I'm tracking with the question.
Okay, so there won't be any more changes to this particular part of the code based on what feedback you get from Public Works?
I wouldn't say there would be any more changes to the design criteria. I expect changes before the next meeting to the design criteria. We want to go through it and come one more time, in particular with Public Works, to make sure what goes in the design standard goes in the design standards, what stays in the art and the aesthetic stays in the aesthetic. Probably more than anything, though, is to look at consistency within that design. There's some conflicting language in there. I even caught it again today going through it. Like the design, I think one area says offsets from a pole will be determined by the pole owner. Other parts it says 4 inches. Other parts we've corrected it to 6 inches. So that needs to be tightened up. So there'll be some. That's the kind of cleaning up I was talking about that needs to occur in the design section of the code.
Okay, great, thank you. This question is under, gosh, this is really long. Again, same design requirements, but under 6H.
6H.
And my question there is, what does defer to the pole owner mean? So I think that's probably your comment in there, that you said defer to the pole
Are
owner.
you reading from the actual draft itself, 6H,
Yeah, I think I was.
36H?
6H, yeah, due to the different antenna deployments from different providers.
And-
I think your comment probably said you would defer to the pole owners, and I wasn't sure what that meant.
Public Works, and as he's working with them, potentially PSE, potentially an HOA.
Okay.
And if you're talking about my comments in the matrix, I should share with you, I take those fairly lightly. I tried to provide, I was about between 6 and 7 o'clock last night.
Right.
Because I just got it before. I tried to do a quick scan through and give you something to base on, something to look at, and a quick snapshot before we had the meeting tonight. I would not hang my hat completely on my answers in there because I want to sit down and digest all that. I didn't have a chance to digest them all, but I wanted to give you a quick overview of what we thought, or sort of a first blush of
Absolutely.
the comments that we had.
Yep.
And so there will be some hiccups, not maybe, there will be some
Yeah,
hiccups in
and that's
those
why
comments. Yeah.
I'm asking for clarifications.
Okay,
I think this is a
okay, yeah,
perfect
yeah.
avenue to do that. I think there are some, again, comments in there which say, and again, I'm trying to understand which way we're going. So this is for 7H or 7E as well, where it says, you're okay with accepting the change that has been suggested by the provider, but the text has not been edited in these places. So again, a clarifying question for me is, does that mean you're accepting the changes, not accepting the changes? Because I think
No,
that's
again,
sort of,
I would hang my hat on what I shared with you before. I'm really not super comfortable giving you a definitive answer to all of the design stuff and the edits I got back in my brief comments. They're, like I said, it was a quick snapshot. Again, I would say that we're going to try to clean that up and get it back to you folks that has those redundancies and a better analysis and review of the comments from the provider. I hope that answers your question. It may not be to.
well, I think it's more confusing actually because, we're reviewing what's in the code, right?
Yes.
And the feedback that we got from the providers is feedback that we got from them. And then, it still feels like this is not completely done then. And it still needs more revisions in spite of, and I think there's some comments which you've taken and implemented and some you haven't. So I'm just struggling a little bit to, know which way to go because I thought this was pretty much a done deal by now. Some edits probably that come out from today's meeting.
Correct. I would say no, the design section is not a done deal. And that's why I pointed that out on my PowerPoint presentation. That's one of the areas that we need to clean up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me just see.
If I could jump in there, though.
Yes.
David Pyle, Community Development. So the way we see this is that this draft is, for all purposes, complete. We have made it available to the public, including the providers, for consideration, review, commentary. We did set a deadline by which we had asked to receive comments, understanding that comments are received until the end of the public hearing.
Right.
And that deadline was really more of a courtesy deadline for us in order to be able to respond to those comments to you all. We did receive comments up until this afternoon. So obviously when we receive pages of comments from interested parties, we're not able to respond in short order like that. So we haven't had time to review all of the comments that we had received, even though we had asked for a courtesy deadline, which wasn't followed. Right. So given that, we're kind of in a position here where we feel that the structure of this code, we feel that Dennis is just telling me we didn't set a deadline for comment on it, but
Did not for the providers. We had some conversation. We had internal deadlines, but as we were talking about it, the providers were going to come and they could share their feedback and comments to the PC on their terms.
So correction there, but nonetheless, when we get stuff right before the meeting, we can't really respond to it that quickly. We do see this draft as complete. We do see it as having been reviewed by our consultant on numerous occasions, by our legal counsel. We see the structure as complete. What we're really looking for is some direction from you of what you think we should delete or add, what might be missing, so that we can bring it back for the purpose of a public hearing.
Sounds good. And it's just because it's so technical that, I don't want us to miss out on anything that maybe the providers are bringing, which we definitely want to see, or, do not want to change our code.
And
that's why.
as Chair Boffman pointed out in opening, it is an evolving industry. And 6 months from now, we might know something different than we know now. So I think that no matter how many times we release this draft for commentary, we're going to continue to see more and more comments added to it. I don't know that it would ever be considered complete for that purpose. So there's a point where we have to put our pick in the sand and move on and work on other projects here at the city.
If I could dovetail onto that real quick, and I should have probably even added a slide here. The evolution of the changes, and the director's right, it's going to be an ongoing, for lack of a better term, a bit of a living document. Even if council adopts it in whatever form planning commission recommends, these folks are going to have technological changes within that 5G community as it's deployed. I mean, I've been reading articles and talking with folks about that. On top of that, we know there's a push in Congress for changes to the rules. We know there's court cases out there pending. Any of those, we're going to be back visiting with you folks to update and change this code.
One more thing, and then I promise I'll be quiet. Is really what we're trying to do is strike a balance. We right now don't really have rules that address a lot of what is forecasted to be built. And we understand that the providers want to do business here. They're members of the community. They want to provide a service that our citizens want. We want our citizens to be able to receive that service at a reasonable rate. So we don't want to increase the cost artificially because we're asking for all these things to be done. But at the same time, we also have a community to look out for and to safeguard against uncoordinated deployment. A really good example that I think is a comparable example here is with regard to when the city made a conscious decision to require undergrounding of new utilities, wired utilities. So that is a comparable type of design requirement that we impose on Puget Sound Energy for the deployment of new power infrastructure. So, or even the other comm type infrastructure. And we require that it be undergrounded, which is a significant cost. And believe me, when we had those discussions around those types of rules, I was in another city. I remember having those conversations. The utility providers definitely were not on board, and we had very much similar conversations with the utility providers at that point. So thinking about trying to treat this type of utility equally as we would treat someone like PSE, well, we require undergrounding. So we could require these types of design things to be deployed in the community to look out for the interests of the community in a much way as we did with the PSE type requirements.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Larry, go ahead.
Okay. I'm down to two questions. The first one is, will 5G speed up our meetings? Okay. Now the second question, and it was brought up during this discussion about pole ownership. If a provider puts a pole in the ground, do they still, or a pole for 5G, do they own it? Or does that become, they have to maintain it, but does it become theirs or the city's still? Excuse me.
I can answer that one. If the provider is putting a pole or a tower, it is theirs. There will be an agreement for them to use. If it's in the right of way, that's what the franchise agreement, or if we had a lease agreement or whatever, those are agreements for them to use our land. But the infrastructure, the poles are the ownership of the purveyor of the utility company, and it's their responsibility to maintain it.
And that leads me to that 4 to 6 inch issue. Maybe someone else can answer this, but do providers allow other providers on their pole?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Depending, like PSE, if you go out here and you look at the power poles, there's CenturyLink, there is the schools, we are on it. I mean, there are several utilities and they lease it out.
Okay,
So they have
thank you.
agreements themselves.
Roisin?
Yeah, I just had one or two very quick things, and it's really about communication of the application process to the general public. And I like to see that it's on page 21 of our packet. It's kind of pretty clear about how all that happens. I just had one or two things to ask about. So, for example, when a provider needs to get in touch with HOAs, is the city providing that contact information, or is it up to the provider to figure that out too?
I think it's going to depend on the provider. If they have that contact and they have that information, whatever resource they have, they can. But if they don't, they stop in by at City Hall, then I think we would try to assist them and give them that information. Yeah.
Yeah, typically, we're actually actively working on building an updated list of our HOAs because we could use it ourselves when we're reaching out. But also there are other tools, like if you go to King County IMAP, you can do a property search and you can find out the registered owner there as well, and they have contacts.
That's great. And then the last thing I had was on page 21 of our packet, where it's talking about on number 4, where notification is required, written notification shall be included at a minimum. And it says, in lieu of providing the above information, the applicant could provide a website. And I'm not really that crazy about in lieu. I think I know a lot of us are very able to get online and look things up, but there are sectors of our population that are not. And I think if you're going to provide a website, I think that's a very nice additional thing. But I still think residents need to get this information in a hard copy in the mail wherever possible.
And what was that citation again, please?
It's so it's 21A.56.095, number 4.
Thank you.
And that's really all I had. Thank you.
How about Josh next?
I do have some. Before I start, Dennis, I just want to say, very good job. This is a job I don't envy, so thank you for going through all this effort for us. The 1,000 feet you mentioned in the presentation, in reading the comments back, my understanding from some of the comments was they had concerns about having to contact every building owner or other WCF for determining if they could co-locate there. And then, and only then, could they go to the next step of the process. They might have an issue with also noticing 1,000 feet radius for construction, but that was one thing that I was concerned about, because that seems like a pretty big hurdle in order to get a new WCF up.
So again, that's one of those whips, if you will, and a carrot. So by making it the 1,000-foot area, that process applies in the small wireless facility. Let's use that in the small wireless facility for, let's say, a batched application. If they meet all the criteria, it's going to go through the exemption, okay, which is great for the staff, great for the provider, and they would have to do that. If we make that ring smaller, and the reason I took 1,000 feet is I matched the noticing requirements that's currently in the code, 1,000 feet. And so I matched that with that, and the idea being that, okay, you're exempt from the noticing requirements, but you contact all those property owners, they're going to know you came, and they have to do that work before they make application. Okay, because when they make application, the clock starts ticking, okay, on the shot clock. And so how do you marry up, well, we don't want to go through the whole notification process, because then why is it exempt? And, basically all the comments we've heard about these just popping up and no notice going out, right? So it was a creative way,
I think,
to try and make them get a hold of everybody. Then they come in and they do the application, and then the clock starts, but everybody within that 1,000-foot area knows that, oh, it's going to be going over here.
So maybe I'm confused a little bit then, because separate from the construction notice.
That is correct.
This is separate from the construction notice.
Correct.
Okay.
It sounds like you're talking about the 1,000 feet. There's a 1,000-foot public notice. There's 1,000-foot, then there's the construction notice, which is the adjacent notice.
Yeah.
It's really not a notice what we're talking about. It's really going and talking to all the property owners within 1,000 foot to see if they can connect to pole, property structure, whatever. okay, and then providing that documentation. So it's not a notice, it's documented that they went in within that 1,000-foot radius and contacted everybody to get an affirmative they can locate. Okay, and by doing that, you've contacted as many of those folks in that area that's going to eventually locate. Does that make sense? And so by default, you've let all those property owners know by doing that, oh, there's a cell tower coming into the area. Does that make sense? Okay.
Okay, I'll dive into that a little bit more offline. Completely, this might be really off the wall, but the design standards and aesthetics, can you in like 1 or 2 sentences explain the difference between those two?
Yeah, aesthetics is how it looks. How's it going to look? Is it going to be a bunch of coiled up cable, okay, which we've seen, okay, they're out there, and it's not the folks here that are going to be talking to you tonight, they're representing their clients on their behalf, and they're going to want to try and deploy as cheaply as they possibly can. But the technicians out in the field, they're working. It may be raining, it may be snowing. They got 40 feet of extra cable. Do we cut it? Do we splice it? We'll see where it's just coiled up and attached to a pole and left there. Well, that's not aesthetically pleasing, right? And especially in some of our communities, that could be a real eyesore, and we might hear about that. And so that's an aesthetic issue. A design issue could be, okay, it is so far from the right of way, and it has a structural load that can hold an antenna array and the equipment box, and at the same time it has that structural capability of holding that. But if a car hits it, like tonight, it will shear and go down without damaging or hurting minimizing the damage to the car, minimizing the damage to the driver of the car.
Okay, so I should think of design standards more of like structural standards?
Structural standards, it would be correct. And that's why they go to the engineering guys, the public works guys.
Can I offer just because I do some of this for a living?
Yeah.
Typically, design standards are objective. This dimension, this size, this distance. Aesthetics are subjective. Does it look nice or not nice? And that's usually a pretty clear divider of those topics. So I think that's kind of what you're saying.
Is there a way with the design standards, because some of the concerns I've read has been that technology is changing and we don't know what it's going to look like in a year, that we can kind of decouple the design standards from the code and make it more of like a separate internal city process or a different process so that we can be more nimble with the changes as, things obviously get better?
That is a great question, only because we had a lot of conversation about that. Originally, it was sort of looking that way when we were first drafting this up as sort of like a standalone book that could be modified. The problem, I think, that we start running into is just what I shared with you earlier in my presentation, that we don't want to create a situation of where, okay, the Planning Commission has done a recommendation, the council's approved it by code, and 3 months into it, staff's over here tweaking it. And it's not what you guys recommend, it's not what council approved. And then it gets built out there. And so that's the risk of making it loose like that. And I don't think that's what the Planning Commission wants, I don't think that's what the council wants. We want concrete direction so we can give concrete answers so it can be built how it's seen. If there's a technology shift, we'll be back. And as we shared with you earlier, I have no doubt we'll be back within a year or two, if not sooner. If not for technology shifts, because of legal questions being resolved about the FCC rule. And so it's a tough situation. I think it makes a lot of sense to have that flexibility, but in terms of that flexibility, there's a cost, and that cost would be that sort of putting staff in the position to make some arbitrary decisions about what is aesthetically pleasing and what's not. There's been some, and I wish legal was here, but there are some court cases about that can get us sideways if staff is arbitrarily saying, I don't like that, I like this. If we have it laid out in code, it really tightens that up.
Actually, so probably add a little bit more to that. By separating out and putting the technical standards into the engineering public works details, public works standards, it allows us to conform with other codes, other kind of the guidelines that we have by ourselves, by the city, and in how we manage the right of way. Additionally, for us to update those standards, we do have to go through council because those standards are approved and adopted by the council by ordinance. As we did back in 2015, when we last updated our standards, there were items that the council did direct us to go to the Planning Commission and go for their support and recommendations to then return back to the council. It can be very similarly done with whatever we do. We're working on an update to the standards right now. We're trying to incorporate the town center. We're also going to be incorporating the 5G and additional cell information as well to then go to the council and possibly have a recommendation to come back to the Planning Commission.
Okay. Kind of on that same line, I was reading in Bellevue's code, they had something where it looked like, and I could have been reading it wrong, that if the carriers came to you or whoever was building it came to you and said, look, we know that the code says this, but this does the same thing but better, but it doesn't comply, could there be an exemption for?
That may fall within our variance criteria.
But
It
then that's
may.
extra work for them, for the
It is
carriers
extra
to
work for
provide
them.
us
We
a better
we
result.
really don't want that. We really want to keep it clean.
Okay.
And there's some benefit for them, right? There is. I mean, if they stay within those parameters, they come into the exemption and bam, we can kick that out pretty quick. That's what-
One thing you could request that we do here as an option is that when it gets down into the details around design standards for exempt facilities that are governed by a franchise agreement, is that if an alternative standard is approved through a franchise agreement, that we would accept that as a design standard.
Because the franchise agreement goes through council.
Because the franchise agreement goes through council. So one of the, and what we're doing there is that we're, franchise agreements go through council in public session, the public has opportunity to comment, and then what happens is that becomes the design standard that applies to that provider for the deployment of that piece of infrastructure. We have the code here to provide the baseline. It helps us when there is no franchise agreement, because we will still see facilities be deployed without a franchise agreement where there's a right-of-way lease agreement instead, which the council's not involved in. So really by doing that, you're able to respond to changing technology or to the needs of a unique provider, et cetera.
Okay, I personally think that sounds good. I don't know what everyone else thinks, but in one of the comments, the notice with the door hangers, I don't know. There are some places where a lot of people don't like door hangers on their door because it signifies you're not home. If you haven't picked it up in a few days, I don't know, HOAs might have some rules around that, and then some access in some areas where it might be difficult. So mail might be I don't know, I just thought I'd note that as a potential problem. One of the providers made a comment about, and I think I sent this to you, maintaining the facilities, they wanted it increased to 6 months before they had to go in and fix whatever deficiency the city noted. And I think 6 months is way too long. If they can't get it fixed in 90 days, there's the option to ask for, forgiveness and extend to 6 months at that point. I'm assuming this is covered in the franchise agreement, but is there any liability limitation for the city with all these poles going up? There's going to be like 500 up 228th, and any accident could knock over a couple. So I'm guessing.
We do. Any agreement we have does have an insurance requirement that we use WCIA that has to be approved.
And what about an HOAs on private property? How does that?
Typically, well, if it's on private property, it's a lease agreement between property owner and the utility purveyor and whatever agreements they have with that. But if it's in a public right-of-way, it follows into our insurance requirements.
And are there instances where the HOA might not own the road, but they own the sidewalk so does that kind of fall into a gray area where the city could become a party to something like that?
If it's outside the right-of-way, outside the land that we actually are responsible for, it would be the HOA. So yes, there are some instances. One of them is Augustine, which is just under construction off of 212, where the sidewalk is actually on an easement that's granted by the HOA. So any poles, any utilities that would be behind the sidewalk really would be an agreement between the HOA or private property owner, depending on where the lot lines are, and the utility.
Is there a window to complete the install after permit's been approved? Application's been approved?
If it's, the exemption part is going to be exempt from land use, so the other approvals would be building permit, right-of-way permit, whatever the time window is for that. But at the end of the day, there's the shot clock, right, that we have to get it done. by
That's for
shot
the
clock, but-
approval
But that's
of
for
the-
approval. Construction,
We do have timeframes on our right-of-way permits and also building permits where, if they do, if a utility contractor doesn't make the clock or don't start construction within 30 or 60 days, I can't remember what it is, they do have an opportunity to ask for an extension, but
So
they
it's
would have
all
to come to
addressed
us.
in other parts of the code?
It's usually typed to the permit itself on the deadlines of those.
Can we explore adding, having them add a contact phone number and an ID so that any concerned citizen can contact somebody if there's an issue?
on any of the noticing?
No, I'm sorry, on the WCFs, and on the small cell towers themselves.
So a sign on each tower,
Not a sign, but like some sort of label that says, if there's any issues,
like a
contact.
little tag.
Yeah, something that, so someone can call someone if something happens.
They're often found on the labels found on PSC poles, so I think that's a pretty common thing to have. So I don't.
I see some heads nodding there from the providers, so, yeah, okay.
And I wanted to ask about, I can skip the rest of this, the city-owned parks
Yeah.
and disallowing within city-owned parks. I completely understand aesthetically not wanting to have a bunch of those towers in there. At the same time, we have events in city parks, coverage in the city's not always that great. So is there a way we can make it look?
We had
Is-
discussions, I don't think the parks is open to that. We talked even about cows, the cells on wheels they're just not there. And we looked at a park and some of the measurements, and basically, you could put a tower around the park, and it would work for the most part.
That would be a macro tower.
But I think even a micro, I think could possibly work. On private property.
Okay.
Thank you. On the right-of-way way, yeah,
Yeah, I was under the impression that the small cells were like 250 to 500, maybe 1,000 feet max range. And then if you've got trees, you've got more issues, and a lot of our parks have those trees in them. So,
I think my feedback is going to be thin. I suspect the providers would agree with you, but I'm going to hang my hat here and go out and be a bit speculative in that we looked at it, we think they can go on the right of way and around the park, but not only that, that's today's technology. We know it's evolving, and so we could find ourselves where we've allowed them in the park, and a year from now, they didn't need to be in the park.
yep, I understand.
You might also, as a matter of, when we get to public hearing, make a recommendation that the city council consider allowing them in parks.
Oh, I don't know that I want to be the one to say that. I'm just asking why. Why, if that was considered, if there's any way to hide them better. And that's all I've got. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mark? Nothing? Nothing. Okay. Eric, go ahead.
So I want to parrot the appreciation for working on this code to staff. A lot of what we've talked about has been aesthetics, and visual quality of things. In the older code, there was some language centered around the acoustic kind of maintenance of the environment when it came to emergency power generation, for example. And I was wondering if we had that still somewhere in here addressing that.
We have a reference to not exceeding the noise standards established by the city.
Right, but it's also kind of tied to the community character aspects. Different parts of the community have much different ambient noise levels than other areas. And so I think that the older code had some requirement to basically take a measurement of the ambient noise and then not exceed that by a certain amount during kind of emergency power generation situations where they would have to provide some acoustic, baffling or some enclosure or something to kind of take care of that. So I think it would be nice to kind of look at that and see if there's some application here.
So seek acoustic baffling for backup generators is what I'm hearing. And a sound, and a decibel level.
Yeah, because there's places, I mean, in the neighborhood I live in, you know, when everyone's gone to work, you can go out in the street and you hear, you know, the birds. I mean, you don't hear anything. And so having a generator kind of grinding away over there would be very disruptive in that instance. There's some other areas where you might have all kinds of, you know, downtown traffic, and a generator might be completely lost in all that.
So we actually hear two different sides to that. One side is there's people who during power outages welcome the quiet and welcome the retreat from what is known to be the world today. There are others who very much want that emergency generator to kick on immediately and power their lives. So finding that balance is a tough one, especially when much of these networks are considered to be the backbone of our emergency services. So I think you'd have a pretty strong argument from, we hear what you're saying, and we'll look into whether we can add a section around consideration of noise. Further, most of these networks that we're seeing now don't have these backup generators like they used to, and they have battery backups. The battery backups are designed to last a certain amount of time. There's a certain standard that applies to it. I know that our emergency manager, Andrew Stevens, has actually been looking into this as a matter of how do we deal with longer term outages here in the city, and how do you recharge the network for cell services if we were to experience a longer term outage like we did back in 2006, I think it was, when the windstorms rolled through here.
All right, I have a couple. Please bear with me.
Oh, dear.
I'll go fast, Rasheen. I'll try. First one. So first, looking at the matrix that you said, Dennis, which was the previous comments, I'll call it. There's the section that talks about the underlying land use
Yes.
permits.
Yes.
And I would like to advocate for making sure that that language gets adjusted so that it doesn't give the appearance that the only choice is for the city to change its land use if there's a, so in other words, if someone were to request a facility on some piece of property, and this may be a very unlikely event, I'm not sure, but if they're requesting something on a piece of property where the current land use wouldn't necessarily allow that, I don't know, park, something like that. The way this reads, the only option is then for the city to go, oh, okay, we'll change our land use. No. If it's not in compliance with the land use, one option should be to say, I'm sorry, you can't locate there because it doesn't comply with the land use. If you'd like to apply to try to change request a change, that's a normal
note
process.
3 under table A.
Yeah.
Correct? Okay.
Yep. Next one it has to do with something that was mentioned a bit earlier is I'm concerned that there may not be enough clarity or robust language around private property. And the reason I say that is because I think that there's going to be the potential for homeowner associations and private property owners to have the perception that this is all in control of the city. And in fact, if it's something that's being done on private property, there's actually, I think, very little control on behalf of the city. So I want to make sure that we're really clear in here. And if that comes up when somebody's standing in here at the desk and upset about something on private property in Tamarack, for example, that there's something to be referred to say, I understand, but it's on private property. See here where we described that. I don't know what the limits are around all of those discussions, but I think we just want to be very crystal clear about the dividing line between public right-of-way and private property. Because frankly, even if all of us understand that, there's lots and lots of other people that will not understand that. And I can't give you specific examples, but there's a couple of places where we talk about private
I think
property.
I understand what you're saying. You want to be, we have a very hard and fast process. I'm giving you feedback to make sure I have your thought captured here for right-of-way public property. And we talk about private property and on private roads, but nowhere in the code does it say a lot of that yes, no rests with the property owner in terms of even allowing those facilities to be on private property. Am I hearing that right?
Yes, I'd like to see a little bit of reinforcement that this applies to publicly controlled property right away, essentially. And for private property, the negotiation needs to be with the appropriate party, which we would all go, yeah, of course, right? But I'm not so concerned about any of us. I'm concerned about all the folks out there and all those HOAs that didn't show up to the meeting and so on and so forth. There's certainly, I think, potential for conflict there. And to the extent that we can help and or avoid getting drawn into it, that would be a good thing. I had mentioned, and I'd like to also comment again, that I want to confirm, and I didn't take the time to do this, haven't had time, but what does the city's tree policy say about pruning and trimming? And make sure that is there something in there? If there is, we need to comply.
And in fact, I did a little bit of digging. It's interesting. It's mentioned in the standards of Public Works, and then also reverts back to the tree code. I forget the numbers, 21.37, I think? 21A37, the tree code. And so it's in the standards as well as within 21A37.
Okay. And we referenced that in here, so that should be good. I think that we had also talked about, and I'd like to make sure that we double check the lighting standards, that we're not creating any kind of potential conflict in the code between what we say about lighting here and what may exist in the public works standards about any type of lighting.
We originally had in the code a more defined narrative of that. We backed off of the draft and thinking, okay, well, FAA has standards, FCC may have some standards, let's just hang our hat on those. But I would almost suggest we may go back and revisit that and maybe even put back those standards we talked about. And I'm doing that in light of the conversation with the HOA members and their concern that we met with them, they're concerned about the dark skies areas. So you may have a neighborhood that's a dark sky area that there may be a pole out there that has to have a light on top of it to meet the FAA standards, but the intensity, maybe we had some language that sort of capped that a little bit. So we could maybe go back and explore that. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, at the very least, I would request that whatever standards we have, that's the first tier, right? So let's not violate any standards that we already have in the public works provisions elsewhere, if there are any. Okay. I really hate when we don't pay attention to that and we create conflicts in the code. So let's at least be certain that we're not doing anything that is a conflict with the public works standards that exist.
Got it.
And then if we want to continue past that and say, okay, we'd like to add some of these other things, that's great. Then I think that's fine. But let's not create any kind of conflict to begin with.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I do appreciate that because we do have standards in the public works standards for lighting. But then when we start talking about dark sky, an incident just happened regarding shields, the use of shields and lighting that goes in, that kind of oversteps the right of way and kind of goes into the private property. So those are things we want to be aware of.
Okay. Can I keep going? Now I'm on the comments from AT&T. This one is simple. I just want to reinforce that. So in general, when I look at these and you've said, agreed, okay, we'll make the change, whatever, I didn't look at any of those. So if that changes, let us know. Yeah, exactly. From what you said earlier, let's just make sure we'll come back and see those. There's this one about 56035, number 2, which has to do with signage, and you were clear in that we were not changing that, and I would like to reinforce my comment that I agree with you and would be strongly opposed to allowing any wiggle room in that particular provision. And I apologize, I forgot my reading glasses, so some of these are a little questionable. Go past that. Yeah, most of these, I think your comments I generally agreed with. And I think it's important that before we move forward with this, there's quite a few instances here where you've said needs follow-up, needs confirmation, like this one right here. small wireless cell pole means. This has to do with definitions, and your comment is this language is taken right from the FCC rules. I'd just like to make sure before we get to our next discussion about this, as many of those follow-up things that you know need to be followed up get completely cleaned up so that this is as clean as possible. I guess I'd just go back then to kind of the overall concerns that I have. We've talked about private. Yeah, the main one that remains, we talked about it a little bit here, and you kind of said, well, we're not sure what to do with that. I have significant concerns still about properties that are not typical. So those areas where, you know, we have a sidewalk right at the back of the curb and then the front yard of someone's home, or no sidewalk at all, or, you know, some neighborhoods where there's nothing but some of the older neighborhoods that have literally a drainage ditch next to the asphalt. And what, you know, it's one thing to put even some visual suggestions of what the deployment might look like in those instances. But so far, all we've really done is said, here's an example of what it might look like if we have a street that's built to the current public works standards. And frankly, I can tell you for a fact that we have many areas of the city that are not in compliance with the current public works standards because A, they didn't exist back then, what King County had was minimal, and what they did have, they didn't enforce. So I had hoped to take some pictures from the neighborhood where I live in North Sammamish, but I have not been home in the daylight since the beginning of the week, so I haven't been able to do that. Of course, that only occurs for about 2 hours a day. So I do think that that is an area that I'm not convinced that we have adequately addressed yet. And I know that your concern is probably that you don't know what to do with it. I agree, but I think that it's going to be a problem potentially in the future. And so I would like to have some pictures to look at and say, and maybe even be able to ask the providers, what are you going to do here? Because what we have is a situation where there's not a simple way to deploy. There's just no options. So what are we going to do? I'm concerned that we've not really addressed that.
So good point, and we understand the complexity of the one size does not fit all here. The good news is in some of the older neighborhoods, there's overhead power. They haven't been undergrounded.
Yeah. I'm sorry. In the neighborhood I'm talking about, there's not a lick of overhead power. It was all undergrounded.
Wow.
No poles.
So
there are light poles in some corners, not even all the ones there should be. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of legacy stuff out there that this will not fit nicely into.
And again, that becomes a case-by-case basis. We encounter that with all sorts of development regulations. City engineer, Mr. Zaggers, can attest to that. We've got all sorts of situations here in the city that we have to deal with. And I think that would be just a case-by-case basis. But I do get your point. And if you had some photos and we could try to ask the providers what it might look like in that scenario.
Yeah, my comment in a shorter version would be, I think that particular area needs further discussion.
I have an idea, but I won't take up time tonight. But I'll explore that idea with some other ideas. I might even call the providers, but there may be a way.
I think this is one of those things, if you see a couple of images, you'd go, oh yeah, that's kind of a problem. And in representing, in helping the council represent the members of the community, I want to make sure that this is a non-technical issue. This is an issue for neighborhoods, and I want to make sure that we adequately address it to the extent that we can. And even if we decide we can't do anything, we've at least taken the time and looked at the situation and understood that it's going to be a challenge for staff potentially in the future and for some neighborhoods. Now, I'm hopeful that perhaps the deployment will be at a pace that by the time it gets to these older neighborhoods, the technology will have changed enough that there will be some simpler solution, but maybe not.
So I think of it kind of like deployment of like a fire hydrant, and generally they find a place to put it. It doesn't always work in the near term, but then people adapt to it. in instances like Inglewood and Tamarack, where we have older, undersized roads that were not developed out that actually have reverted to private ownership, they would not be allowed, and they would be subject to the neighborhood's allowance of it upon negotiation. So those areas are sort of taken out of the equation here because those are not actually public rights of way. And then we're left with some of the middle generation construction where, like you said, it's undergrounded, but there's no sidewalk built. There's no amenity zone. People's landscaping goes right up to the edge of asphalt. Maybe there's a ditch. Where are you going to put the pole, the monopole? How are you going to get the underground fiber to connect it? Where's the power coming from? I think those are all valid questions.
And I think I would only offer a slight caution that I have a difficult time comparing this to fire hydrants or PSE for a wide variety of reasons, not the least of which we've got 3 commercial providers who will certainly utilize the rules to the best of their ability. PSE is kind of, they have a lot of history. They have they're by themselves, and so we can interact directly with them a little more easily. Fire hydrants are a public amenity that is low to the ground. In some of these older neighborhoods, if we had 3 providers come in and plunked out a bunch of poles in people's front yards, that would not be the outcome that this commission or the city council wants. And so I don't think it's entirely comparable, and I want to be cautious about that, not go forward blindly.
And that's well received. One of the constraints that we are dealing with, however, is that the FCC is deliberately comparing this type of infrastructure to PSE's infrastructure. So that's one of the challenges here, is that the providers are reminding us, hey, FCC has basically put us in the same box as PSE. Mm-hmm. So we're challenged by that, and I think we're making headway on it, and we're coming to closure on it, and we'll look into your concerns.
Yeah, that's all I'm really asking. And I will just reiterate that I understand what you've just described, but I feel pretty passionately that neither this commission nor the city council nor the members of this community are going to be bullied into capitulating on the way that our community looks and works. And so, that's fine. Let's get it on. Okay, that's the only comments I have. Larry, did you have something else?
And I'm serious about this. The chair is very eloquent in stating about the sense of Sammamish or the vision. And I want to segue from that. We have an opportunity now to get the work done. And I waited before appreciating staff, because this is kind of a teamwork for the first time that needs the collaboration of staff, planning commission, city leaders, residents, and other stakeholders, and the providers. And to me, it just presents an opportunity to get it right and make it work. And if all possible, make everybody happy. Not only did we learn, but we had fun doing this, because it will be a legacy. Then that's enough.
With that tie, Larry, how could we not have fun? Does anyone else have any comments? I think it would be an important topic of discussion. The holidays are coming, so that's difficult, but to decide whether we're all convinced that we're going to be ready for a public hearing and a recommendation by the January 16th meeting. I want to be really certain that we're all in agreement that we're ready by that point.
I'll be ready if you tell me to be ready. I'll be ready.
Yeah, we need to discuss that internally. There's a few points I'm hearing here where we could tighten it up, make some additions, noise, for example, clarification around right-of-way versus private property, for example. Those are pretty simple additions. The last one that we heard from the chair on is really the one that in my mind drives some complexity in how we proceed. It's the challenge there is that it's really complex. It's an easy way to put it. To write rules that respond to different neighborhoods. We don't plan on a neighborhood level here in the city. Hopefully we're going that way because I've heard from all of you over the years that you really want us to have rules that are more sensitive to character. And there is character neighborhood by neighborhood here in this city. In this case, trying to develop universally applicable rules to all rights of way. The one thing we can do is narrow down the amenities that are included in the right of way. And that might be an approach to take is when there is no amenity zone and there is no sidewalk and the private property adjoining has been maintaining the landscaping as part of their yard. That the goal is to minimize disruption in that pattern. And the goal is to place the pole or the facility that the provider is attempting to place in the most minimally obtrusive or invasive area. And that it really then becomes a discretionary decision point for the staff involved. The issue there is that when we are dealing with batches and we're getting 20 of these at a time, say on a street where they want to deploy that whole street, it becomes more of a challenge and it's more staff, more of a burden on staff to go out and debate with the provider as to exactly where it should go. So I'm not quite sure how to craft that language aside from putting in some of those subjective discretionary points that then become putting staff in the middle, because where we've been with the old code and where we're trying not to go deliberately is to cause staff to be put in the middle of a debate around a community member who feels that the rule should be applied one way, a provider who feels the rule should be applied the other way, and very little cover for the staff to help make their decision. That's not a place that I want our staff to be in. So we've been working really hard to try to sort stuff in a flow chart sort of way to understand if this, then this. And the one you've raised is it's like, well, maybe. So we'll look at that. And if you have any other ideas, I've really appreciated the ideas this commission has come up with in the past when we've been presented with things like this. For example, the dynamic setbacks that we put together that was your idea. It actually worked out really well in the code. So if you have any ideas about how to achieve that might pop in your head after this meeting, we're all ears.
I guess just going along with that, partially I made my comment about being ready for that reason, but also as much back and forth is kind of continuing with the providers, with adjusting language, it feels like, this has been squeezed into a box because of FCC requirements and our need to get something accomplished. But as I said at the beginning, this is a pretty substantial piece of code to fit into that time period. I want to not just stumble at the end just to meet a deadline. Let's just be sure that, I acknowledge what you said earlier, that the comments will go back and forth forever. That's absolutely correct. We have to have a cutoff point. Let's just be sure that we have the right cutoff point before we do a public hearing and make a recommendation to the council, because my goal for this commission has been and will continue to be that when we make something as a recommendation to the council, we are convinced that we've done the work and that's cleaned up and ready to go. They certainly will have their opinions and their input, but they could, if they chose, approve what we recommended because the work has been done. So I want to make sure we get to that point before we move forward based on a date, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. Much appreciated. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for indulging me. Let's do public comment next on this particular topic. And since we only have a couple folks here, that should be pretty easy. I'll just remind you, please state your name and who you represent and your address when you start your public comment. And since I don't have a sign in, you guys can decide. You can do rock, paper, scissors on who gets to go first.
Excuse me.
Good evening. My name is Gregory Bush. I'm with Wireless Policy Group here tonight on behalf of AT&T. Wireless Policy Group's offices are in Issaquah. So I'd like to thank the Commission for the chance to speak. I appreciate how detailed and in-depth the discussion has been over the last couple of months, both with staff and the Commission. I appreciate that the Commission understands the importance of building a robust, not rigid, a flexible wireless code that appreciates how it, yeah, Freudian slip, I guess, how wireless can evolve over time. And on behalf of AT&T, I'm here, but I also have a slight personal stake in this as well. Part of my job is applying for these small wireless facilities, and there is a non-zero chance that I could be involved in working with this code in the future. So my job is to represent AT&T, but also I would like to reduce the pain points in the code. So with that in mind, there are a few things that stand out to me. AT&T, by the way, has provided the red lines. As of Tuesday, it looks like the Commission has had a chance to review those, so I'll just reference those. Those were prepared by my colleague, and she knows her stuff. The two pain points that stand out to me are the notice requirements and the co-location requirements in the design for small wireless facilities. The requirements that small wireless facilities be designed for co-location drastically changes the designs that can be employed. Some of the designs I've seen are only meant for one carrier, and again, in some of our previous comments, we said that carriers generally like to have a specific RAD center, and if they're competing for the same RAD center, there's no interest in going higher or lower. They want their specific target, and gosh darn it, they're going to go for it. So if there's a requirement to design for the potential of co-location, but no carrier is interested in co-locating, you've just designed a larger small wireless facility that no one's going to use. So that's something to keep in mind. Finally, the notice requirements. This one, in particular, the 1,000-foot search to find a co-locatable structure. This was something I saw in Edmonds, and Edmonds required potential applicants to go out and essentially do the same thing, seek any co-location opportunities and provide evidence that it had done so. It was very quickly removed from the draft when they realized how long it would take not to send these letters and say, hey, are you interested in co-locating? The pain point is the negotiation process. All right, so you get someone say, all right, we're interested in having a small wireless facility here. What are you offering? And then the negotiation begins, and it's not my job to negotiate. You'd have to go to a different part of the company. And then that process could take months or weeks, and who decides how long that's been before someone can step away and say, hey, we have our target to build these facilities. The goal was to build these fairly quickly. That's why the shot clock exists. The shot clock is meant to act as a guidance by the FCC, saying this is a reasonable time for the city to review it. And if there's a mandatory process pre-application that a provider has to go through, and I'm using provider loosely here, it's applicant, AT&T, Verizon, someone who wants to build a wireless facility. If there's a mandatory process, the FCC was quite clear in its most recent order, that starts the shot clock. If there's something that a provider has to do in order to apply, the shot clock starts then. I could quote it to you. But it's clear that it's paragraph 26 and paragraph, I'm just Control F, pre-application, and paragraph 26 and paragraph 145, the FCC says that mandatory pre-application processes start the shot clock. And then they cite a couple of times AT&T has tried to build a site where the city took 800 days to review, approve, or deny this. So these processes can drag on quite long, especially with negotiation. And finally, I noticed we talked about the franchise term. Another part of my job is negotiating franchises. And in Washington, cities, municipalities cannot charge franchise fees for wireless. AT&T isn't looking for a 10-year term because of the CPI or money. It's because every time a franchise has to be renegotiated or brought legal in, that's money. It costs AT&T and it costs the city. It's not AT&T wants to save money. It's because of franchise fees. It's because every time you get lawyers involved, there's money lost on both sides. So those are my big points. I'm happy to answer any questions the commission has. Thank you.
Greg, I'd like to ask you one question. Do you have any, one of the things that we've struggled with as we've gone through this is any even vague concept of what deployment plans look like. Can you comment on that at all? And when my question is, you know, if this was approved, and would AT&T or Verizon, as far as you know, be out there tomorrow, or is it realistically not for 5 years, or what is the timing of some kind of activity that this will result in?
If I was an RF engineer, I'd have a much better idea of what the process looks like. I'm the front-facing part of the operation. I don't make the decisions. I'm told to carry them out. But what I've been able to look up the chain and see is that RF, radio frequency, these are the guys who decide, all right, our network is weak here. We want you to build the site here. And then it gets kicked down the chain and says, okay, well, this is in a park. Obviously, we can't build in a park for whatever reason or another. And progressively more reasonable people get involved as you get closer to me, of course. And a deployment plan, it's determined based on how the network's needs. So I guess to answer your question, it's determined by the strength of the network. So if RF says we want a site built here and it's a capacity need, it's more likely to be a small cell. If it's a coverage need that's needed a wide area, that's more likely to be a macro cell. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I have a question. Can you speak a little bit more to the 90-foot height requirement or limitation on the macro cells so that we can get
90 foot? Okay, well, we're going to have to look at the code here. This is pretty technical, so I'll have to be very confident when I speak here. So
You're with WPG, correct?
that is correct.
Okay. So on the last page 2, the 90-foot height limit on macro towers is unrealistic given the 100-foot tree height is the last bullet here. And I noticed some other comments like that.
Okay, is this Verizon's letter? Because that may be from Kim Allen.
Oh,
It's from Kim, yeah.
Yeah, there's a firewall in WPG. We're consultants, which means
I see.
which means
I
there are people
understand.
involved for Verizon, there are people involved for AT&T, and I don't speak to them. That's not that I'm a persona non grata, it's you know, conflicts of interest.
Okay, yes. Yeah, Verizon Wireless, so not you. Then never mind. Thanks.
Hold your question.
I have a colleague in the audience who can speak to that.
Thanks, Greg. Sorry, do you go by Gregory?
Either one's fine.
Okay, thank you. Vanna, are you next?
Good evening, commissioners and city staff. My name is Devendra Maharaj with Verizon Wireless. My office is located in Bellevue, Washington. First off, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak tonight. Thank you, city staff, for all the work you've been doing towards this code. As we move through this code update over the past months, Verizon has stayed committed in working with the city to create a workable path forward for small wireless facilities and for macro facilities, or WCFs. After numerous meetings, there are still a number of technical and feasible issues that would materially inhibit Verizon's ability to provide quality service to the residents and businesses of Sammamish. Verizon requests that the city incorporate additional stakeholder input prior to the public hearing scheduled for January 16th. With that said, Verizon does support the general direction of the code draft before you today, but we do have some concerns. There is a comment letter that was sent by Wireless Policy Group, Kim Allen, a consultant for Verizon, that you should have in front of you. If you'd like to follow along, I'll briefly go through some of those issues and address some of those concerns. So the draft code requires a type 2 process for variances and relief of standards. This type 2 process adds up to a very infeasible timeline given the 60 and 90-day shot clock. Our request is that all aspects relating to a small wireless facility be processed as a type 1 decision. Next in line would be the draft. Multiple times throughout the code, the draft contains size limitations and location requirements for small wireless facilities that are not technically feasible and also not permitted by the pole owner. Third would be design typicals pictured in the draft, so there are some design typicals and pictures in various locations. Those are not workable and don't reflect a 4G and 5G design. Because technology is changing very quickly, we suggest that those photos, those typicals, be removed from the code and added to a Public Works guidance document, a place where it can be easily, more accessibly updated and maintained currently. It's a little bit more difficult to update once the code has been passed. There's two portions of section 21A 56.130, 1D and 7D, which conflict and oppose each other regarding pole-mounted equipment. It provides for a prohibition of small wireless facility pole-mounted equipment, which, if left, would impair our performance and result in the potential of more facilities to meet our network objectives. The draft code also prohibits macro facilities in parks. Parks have existing poles that we can utilize. What that means is that there's no need for an additional pole. We can even use various stealth and camouflage technology to add visual reducing aesthetics to that pole. One of our focuses for Mackers is to provide safety and emergency communications for our neighborhood. First responders rely heavily on that infrastructure. And because parks have that existing infrastructure and are located centrally within our residential neighborhoods, they're ideal candidates for macro facilities. So we ask that you consider allowing macro facilities within the parks. The code also contains co-location requirements for small wireless facilities. 2 carriers on 1 pole. It's not technically feasible. Like Mr. Bush alluded to, yes, we can be on the same pole, but if we're fighting for the same height, then once one takes that height, it's technically infeasible for me to go above or below. There's also separation requirements, which we have to maintain. It's also not allowed. A lot of the principal pole owners, typically the utility pole owner, does not want more than 1 carrier on their pole. So it makes it not allowable by that principal owner. Lastly, the draft caps the height of macro towers at 90 feet, which we believe to be unrealistic. Sammamish has 100+ foot beautiful trees that would present an issue if we were capped at 90 feet. The city also has large elevation changes, which would provide difficulties when trying to meet our coverage objectives if we had a height cap of 90 feet. We suggest changing that language to a minimum height needed to achieve our network objectives. And with that, thank you very much for this opportunity to provide comments to you today. Verizon is excited to work towards a very workable code that is compliant with the state and federal law while still addressing the aesthetic concerns and values of the community. I am available for questions should you have any.
I had a quick question.
Yes.
When you made reference to the photographs and the designs in the
Yes.
code, is it that you would prefer to provide us with better diagrams and photographs, or you would prefer there would be no photographs and diagrams in the code whatsoever?
It's a little, so the photographs in there don't accurately represent what we're trying to deliver. They don't represent a 4G and 5G design. They're misleading. A lot of the equipment boxes, I know there's no heights called out on there, but they do look very low, and it could be misconstrued by whoever is reading that portion of the code. What we would recommend is just removing all references to that from the code, putting it in its own separate public works document that we can update and maintain much easier rather than having to go through a code process to update should we find something wrong with it. Technology is changing, so you'll find that we may want to update that standard more often than the core language in the code.
Okay. I think some of the things that we grapple with here and we fight with here is because of this, we don't know what this is going to look like.
We have.
And so and so as a result, it's kind of hard then to visualize what is our city going to look like.
Yes. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dennis, I believe we've provided design typicals of what these would look like in a ideal scenario to the city previously.
Okay.
Standards.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you.
So I think I understand, I mean, I do understand how having a 90-foot pole next to a bunch of 100-foot trees would be, pointless. But I'm concerned about making a change that basically says you can go as high as your network objectives require. What would be, I mean, if your engineers were to look at Sammamish and say, okay, this is reasonably what we might expect to have, like this would be, could you give us an upper limit, for example, for us to consider? I don't know if your network objectives look like 200 feet or if they look like 120 feet.
Okay. Well, Sammamish is very unique in its terrain, so it's hard for me to answer that question, being that I'm not a radio frequency engineer. I can tell you typical things of what I've seen, but because of the constraints of unique to Sammamish, I could be leading you down the wrong path. What I can tell you is that we're not trying to put a taller tower than is needed. That's extra money that we do not want to spend. So we are looking for the most efficient, effective deployment. I would say we can. It's really hard for me to say that, yeah, we can say under 120 feet. That is pretty tall. We likely will want to stay shorter than that, but I can't promise you that that will meet our coverage objectives. One thing you have to consider is that if we aren't able to meet the full objective of the solution we're trying to fix, that may require us to have a secondary facility to fill in that coverage that we can't reach with that first facility.
Go ahead.
Quick question. So we put in there that 5G cannot co-locate because we've heard that and we've read that. But I recall when we were first meeting that, and in some of the presentations, that 4G could be macro or micro. 4G could be on the big tower, 4G could be on a small tower. Same way with 3G, is that correct?
We're using the terminologies a little bit inconsistently. We need to think of macro towers or wireless communication facilities and small wireless facilities as vehicles. They're two different types of vehicles that we can use to deploy our technology. Now, the type of technology we put in this vehicle can vary for a location, right? So we can put 4G on the macro sites, we can put 5G on the macro sites. In moderation. On the small wireless facility, which is a vehicle, we can put 4G technology, we can put 3G technology, we can put 5G technology. It's really dependent on what is the answer to the constraints in the area, to the question we're trying to deliver.
And the reason I'm asking is because on the macro version, the 90-foot pole in this scenario, you could co-locate.
What is your definition of co-locate?
You could put, you could share an antenna array with AT&T.
Okay. I was under the way it came across is you were wondering if on a small wireless facility we can put 4G and 5G. Yes, that is something we can do. Co-location with another carrier, while technically we can do it. It's technically infeasible because, like Mr. Bush stated, we are trying to get a certain rad center, a certain height, which is the sweet spot, if you will, for our antennas to be. There's a separation requirement of about 8 to 10 feet, which means if AT&T is in that spot, I have to go 10 feet above, which does not make that an effective site for me. It makes that site less effective, technically making it infeasible for me to deploy
So the
on.
struggle, just to be candid with you in front of the Planning Commission and sharing with you, is when we read the FCC rules, not the actual codified section, but the narrative, when they adopted the rules explaining their narrative, they talk about co-locating. They talk about co-locating amongst providers, right? You gotta have providers saying, well, wait a minute, that doesn't work, but the FCC rules talks about it in the narrative. Right, and so that's conflicting information for us. And I hear you saying you don't want multiple poles for a cost. I don't think the city wants multiple poles either, right? Because then if you had 5G with multiple pole deployment, right, in order for a 5G system to work on the small cell level, and now we have to do additional poles at the 90-foot level because of they can't co-locate. I think that's exactly what the city's trying to stay clear of.
If I may?
Yeah.
I believe we're getting a little bit muddy with the separation between small wireless facilities and wireless communication facilities. The 90-foot poles, we can definitely co-locate. There's enough space, 90 feet, 80 feet, 70 feet, 60 feet. We can have 4 carriers on there, providing that they want that location. That location meets their coverage objective. That's definitely something we can do. We've done it many a times. When we're talking small wireless facilities, which have, per the FCC, a max height of 50 feet and a sweet spot of what the carriers are looking for at about 30, it doesn't leave us with a lot of options to co-locate, especially when it's a utility pole and there's other infrastructure on that pole.
So it's a dimensional issue for you folks in terms of the height, right? In other words, that's what I'm trying to get is the reason we have the co-location and the variance is if you find that unique situation, instead of AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile and whoever dropping 4 poles in a neighborhood, if it needs to be from 50 feet to 60 feet, okay, it wouldn't be our variance process. We just call it a macro, and you could co-locate.
But if we're talking small wireless facility, that height is too high for us to deploy that technology. It would not be an effective use of that technology. We can deploy that with macro technology. It's a different size of equipment,
Okay.
and it could be effective along that lines, but that would be under a different
And
portion
my
of the
questions I'm asking is to help the PC, so stop me if I'm going on, was to try to help you also understand what we're trying to grapple with as well. And so the 90-foot issue under the macro, the height came from an average between the city of Redmond and Issaquah. So 2 neighboring cities on both sides of the city. I just took their maximum height, did an average. It was like 91.5 or something like that, 90. Okay, so they have set height, and it seems to be working. And my understanding is 5G is very sensitive to trees, but the macro, the larger one, it can blow through the tree, the signal, right?
It can. So while 90 feet is a workable height for certain areas of Sammamish, there will be certain areas of Sammamish where 90 feet will not be workable because of the terrain challenges, the changes in elevation, and the possibility of those trees. If we're talking about a specific location, then we can get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of what would work. But we're talking about the entire of the city of Sammamish. Locking us into 90 would prohibit us from making effective deployments in those areas where there are taller trees.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? And I really appreciate this dialogue, and we'll try not to take too much time here. I guess one of the things that's been really challenging for us with the existing code is that our current code allows us to go up to 120 feet in the right-of-way on major arterials. We have a major arterial that fronts King County on the southeast corner of the city, and King County's code, King County Code 21A.27.030, limits the height of a structure in the R zones to 60 feet for all of King County.
Okay.
So where we're getting a little bit of a, and code has been in place for a little while, it's been proven to be workable for the providers. I'm not aware of any lawsuits with King County to change the code because it's not workable. So when I hear from providers that we need to go to 120 feet because of the topographic constraints of the city, yet King County, for all of King County, has a code that says 60 foot is the height limitation for transmission support structures, I'm slightly perplexed because King County is pretty big. It's got a lot of diversity in its topography. So I'm just curious if you've experienced application for permit or have dealt with King County or something along those lines, because one of the issues we have is that we've seen an uptick in the number of towers along our frontage road with King County. And when pressed, we tend to find out that those providers are actually servicing King County and putting a bigger tower in Sammamish, and then our neighbors right behind those towers are typically offended by the size of the towers.
I'd like to make it clear that I'm not asking the city staff and the commissioners to adjust it to 120 feet. I'm asking for some flexibility so that should a carrier need a tower more than 90 feet to meet the objective goals to provide better service to the community, that we have that allowability. In many cases, 90 feet may be sufficient. What I'm asking for is a relief of that standard.
So we have that built in because we add the dimensional variance process. So if 90 feet, if you can show technically your RF guy, it's not going to work, you got to be at 107, hypothetical, that's the variance process. We add that dimensional criteria, so there is relief built in.
Okay.
Without saying, 100 feet, and there's going to be 100 feet in every part of the city, potentially.
Okay, well, I didn't take note of that.
Okay.
I'll take a look at that when I'm in the office tomorrow.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, does anyone else have any thing they want to grill?
Yeah, thanks, actually, for answering all of them.
Move to extend tonight's meeting to 8:40.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to extend the meeting date 40. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. We're extended. I want to thank both of you for being here. I also want to encourage you to pass along some of these comments to the folks that you work with. Our objective, just to be clear, I think, is that we would like to work together collaboratively to have a system that works well in the future, can adapt to technology, but doesn't offend everybody in the city with how it looks. And so if we can work together to figure that out, that's our goal. But there's inevitably a history of utilities and others who've taken advantage and not necessarily always done the right thing. And so there's caution on our side about that. And I think as long as we can continue the dialogue, we can probably work something that can be maybe a good example for others as well. So I appreciate you being here and making your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
That's it. Mr. Stickney, do you have any public comment you'd like to add?
Thank you.
Are you sure? Oh, my.
With the chair's permission, and before I forget, our note taker provided some Christmas cookies that she personally baked, the dough, and boy, is it good. It's a long family tradition and history involved in the making of those cookies. And while we're on holidays, remember we have a big one coming up on the 25th. Also, for those who don't like winter Christmases, you can go to Yellowstone National Park and celebrate Christmas on August 25th. They call it, it's done by the employees of Yellowstone National Park, and it's called Savage Christmas. And on the final note, on the 25th of January, Lunar New Year. That's all.
Thanks for keeping us up to date here. Yeah. A quick note of acknowledgement for Mr. David Pyle, who is now the director for the Department of Community Development. So publicly, congratulations, and we're glad to have you. On our agenda, it says new business, so I'm going to look to you and see, do we have any new business?
There's a few things to be aware of coming up on the agenda. We're welcoming some new council members, so we'll be working with them to try and get a handle on what their priorities are, try and get a handle on what the group's priorities are. We're also going through a bit of a transition with our legal services here. We've had some changes over at our contract legal service, Kenyon Dyson, so some of our previously consultant attorneys have departed and have formed their own legal firm. So we have a little bit of a change there. So we're working through that. We have hired a few new staff members. We promoted Andrew Johnson, who was one of our assistant planners, to an associate planner role, which is great. We really like working with him. He actually served as a planning commissioner down in Maple Valley for a period of time, so is familiar with your activities on that side of the dais. We're hoping to get him in front of the commission sometime this year, so that you'll have opportunity to grill him a little and make him uncomfortable and give him a good time.
Looking forward to that.
We also recently hired another assistant planner who currently works for the city of Mukilteo. Has his master's degree in urban planning from UC Irvine, has worked for, trying to remember the county. Of course, I could always forget this one. I always know it. Down outside of LA, Orange County. And for a period of time as a transportation planner, worked for the city of Phoenix as a planner in the city of Phoenix. And will be joining us here to help us with some of the work we've got on our work plan. We recently promoted Devaney Lund, who was our code compliance coordinator, to code compliance officer. And that's welcome. She's got a lot of great institutional knowledge. Code compliance here in our city is fairly complicated. We have a high level of customer service. She carries with her a great deal of empathy for those that she deals with, because we do often encounter code violations where someone really did not know what they were doing, and we have to find a path forward and work with them on a human level, and she's really good at that, so we're really happy to have her. We are gearing up to start phase 2 of our zoning controls and subdivision code work. And we're going to be assessing what level of priority our city council puts that at. We very much want to start that and work on it. We all really enjoyed working on the last round. There were lots of things here in the city that needed to be fixed, and we just barely cracked the door with the last round. So we're hopeful to do things like add a plan unit development code, which would allow a developer to have some freedom in designing their development, so long as it integrates and fits into the surrounding community. And there are some criteria that you all can help us draft. We're looking forward to trying to find some ways to add incentives for people to build, for developers to build affordable housing or market rate housing even, that is accessible to all members of the community, as we heard from you with your housing strategy work. These are all things that we're considering with the work plan. We're currently looking at your calendar, looking at the city council's calendar, trying to figure out how to populate that, given that we've had a change in leadership, given on multiple levels, given that we've had some major work items completed and brought through the council, like the urban forest management plan, like the zoning controls changes, like some of the comp plan work, like the Santoni land use map change. So that's all under consideration right now, and we should know a lot more within a few weeks. We're hopeful to roll out to you in sometime in the middle of January, I would say, a fairly complete calendar for the year, so that you can start to see how things lay out and how stuff fits together.
Thank you. There'll be a quiz later on all of that. All right. Anything else from anyone? If not, can I get a motion to adjourn?
I motion to adjourn.
Second.
Seconded to adjourn the meeting. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Happy holidays, everyone. We are adjourned.